And on the international front, President Donald Trump has warned Hassan Rouhani not to threaten the United States again. Now, this is after the Iranian president cautioned Trump about pursuing hostile policies against Tehran. Now, Rouhani said war with Iran is the mother of all wars, in quotes, but did not rule out peace between the two countries. Trump's remarks came on the heels of the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, launching a rhetorical assault on Iran's leaders. He compared them to, in quotes, a mafia and promising unspecified backing for Iranians and happy with their government.
The level of corruption and wealth among Iranian leaders shows that Iran is run by something that resembles the mafia more than a government. Right now, the United States is undertaking a diplomatic and financial pressure campaign to cut off the funds that the regime uses to enrich itself and support death and destruction. We have an obligation to put maximum pressure on the regime's ability to generate and move money, and we will do so. At the center of this campaign is the reimposition of sanctions on Iran's banking and energy sectors. As we've explained over the last few weeks, our focus is to work with countries importing Iranian crude oil to get imports as close to zero as possible by November 4th.
Well, Jim Spellman joins us in Washington with an update on today. Jim, very welcome to the show. Now, we're all watching to see if this could now escalate into something certainly more than just a war of words right now. Any news from Washington as to what actions will see Trump willing to take against Iran if this does escalate?
Well, as you heard the Secretary say there, the first stage will be the reimpositions of sanctions as part of the U.S. withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. Two deadlines coming up in about 3 weeks. Some banking restrictions will go back into place, and in November, oil sanctions will go back into place. Those oil sanctions could prove to be extremely damaging to the Iranian economy, depending largely on whether or not other countries decide to go along. But Trump seems to imply military action is possible when he tweets, "You will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered." Back in May, the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis testified before Congress that the U.S. military has plans ready if diplomacy fails, and that these plans are constantly being updated. That could begin with limited airstrikes at Iranian nuclear facilities, but it's impossible to predict how that might escalate should it come to that. But Mattis stressed that military action remains the last resort and that diplomacy remains the primary mode of engagement. Uche?
Well, Jim, we may have to pause that interview right now because we're getting some reports that Chinese President Xi Jinping may be landing soon in South Africa. But in the meantime, Jim, as we wait for him to land, we have seen this side of Trump before when it came to North Korea. We saw that eventually dissolve into diplomacy. Now, given the situation around sanctions with Iran and suddenly the Trump's administration's seemingly hostility towards Iran, the current Iranian regime, where do you see this heading, Jim?
Yeah, it's hard to tell how much of this is simply the art of the deal playing out. Remember, it was less than a year ago that Donald Trump was calling DPRK leader Kim Jong-un, quote, little rocket man, and using similar language to his Iran tweet to threaten the DPRK. Back then, he wrote, quote, they will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. So is this tough talk on Iran merely a way to bring them to the bargaining table to get a new nuclear deal more to Trump's liking? That is certainly possible, and there's no sign at this point that military action is imminent. Donald Trump prides himself in being a deal maker. He could certainly like the bragging rights that came with a new, tougher deal on Iran, but there are some key differences between the situation with Iran and the DPRK. Iran doesn't yet have nuclear weapons. The DPRK does. That's a major dynamic in negotiations. Iran also has oil that many countries, including U.S. allies, would like to have on the market. And there is the relationship between Iran and Russia to consider, plus the ongoing power dynamic in the region between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others. All these factors make it extremely difficult to predict where this is going. And of course, the U.S. president makes just about anything difficult to predict.
And on that note, Jim, we did see oil prices rising today on these tensions over Iran. How do you see this situation impacting the oil market going forward?
Well, I think a lot will depend on how other countries, as I mentioned before, respond to the U.S. oil sanctions set to go back into place in November, and how Iran responds to that. Earlier this month, an Iranian military officer said that Iran could block the Straits of Hormuz if the U.S. moves to stop Iran from exporting oil. Much of the oil from Saudi Arabia and Iraq transit through that waterway. That, of course, would send huge shocks into the oil market. I think it's fair to say we can expect volatile markets for the near future. Back to you.
Well, many thanks, Jim, for that update. Of course, Jim Spellman joining us there in Washington.